IVM.
We'd like to thank Storytel for sponsoring this show. Storytel is an audiobook platform that lets you hear hundreds of thousands of stories on your mobile, PC, wherever you prefer. Now, generally, Storytel is a great deal at $2.99 a month for an unlimited number of books, but for our listeners, we've got something special. The first month for IVM listeners is now just $99. That's an insane deal. It's $200 off the first month. To start you off, let me recommend one of my favorite books, Range, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. It's a book by David Epstein and is one of the most thoughtful books I've read recently. He talks about early specialization and why that's not necessarily the best way to go in a modern world where problems are not always simple and viewing them from multiple lenses are helpful. In the Indian context where we're forced to choose science, commerce, or arts in the 10th standard, I think this is particularly applicable, and it's a great read. So go to storytel.com/IVM, go get your first month at just $99, and check out Range by David Epstein. Great read.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleague Suyash Desai. And as you all know, Suyash tracks the Chinese People's Liberation Army with his weekly newsletter. Today, that's what we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about what the People's Liberation Army has been up to in 2020. Now, this is something that's extremely important from everybody's point of view, given the phenomenal rise that China has experienced and given the military modernization path that the PLA is on. I think something from an Indian perspective, this is something that we've had a rude awakening with regard to this year with the standoff in eastern Ladakh. So we're going to talk about a lot of this, and we're also going to be talking about what are the internal developments that have taken place with regard to the PLA within China. So Suyash, welcome to this conversation.
Hi, thanks Manoj. Thanks for having me.
Let's just go chronologically with the last year, right? Okay, so in January, you're hearing sort of increased tensions that are taking place in the South China Sea, and at the same time, you're hearing that there is this virus in Wuhan that's eventually led to a shutdown in late January. So what's the sort of early part of the year like from a PLA point of view?
Just a point before I talk about happenings of January 2020. The year 2020 was very important for PLA because it marked the first deadline, which was mechanization. So in 2017, when Xi Jinping said that there are 3 deadlines for PLA, the first one was mechanization, which was to be achieved in 2020. Second one was informatization, which was to be achieved in 2035, which is to be achieved in 2035. And the third one, to change the PLA into a world-class army, which is supposed to happen by 2049. So with that background, this 2020 was an eventful year for PLA. They were active on multiple boundaries. There were pressures from outside and within inside. So January 2020, there are 3 important things that are happening with regards to PLA and China. One, it was the early stage of outbreak of COVID. So if you remember correctly, Manoj, PLA was only activated in the last week, I think 23rd or 24th of January. So initial stages, PLA was not active in fighting against COVID. Also, January 2020 was Taiwan elections. I think it was 20th January or 18th January, if I'm not wrong. So a lot of pressure tactics, developing pressure tactics, this was given to PLA. So a lot of going into Taiwan's ADIZ, going into Taiwan Strait, crossing the median line, these are sort of activity, building pressure. This was the responsibility given to PLA. Also, in a backdrop in December 2019, a sort of standoff started with Indonesia. Chinese standoff started with Indonesia over the Natuna Island. So PLA was also involved in that in early January 2020.
So essentially what we were seeing was that there was, and this is in some ways, I wouldn't want to call it regular activity, but at least from the point of view of the South China Sea, you could see that the Chinese Navy has been sort of trying to increase its pressure sort of activities, those sort of, low intensity challenges that it poses to different actors within the South China Sea. And you could see that starting in December itself. And in January, you rightly said, in the early January, I think about 6th to 7th of January was the elections in Taiwan. And that's when you saw increased pressure from Beijing. And you also, I think there was a speech from Xi Jinping in which we sort of threatened, I think one of the sort of first times when he was sort of being far more aggressive about reunification. And then you had COVID. And at COVID, I remember we had done this assessment which looked at what the PLA did through late January and February and even March across Hubei province. And the big headline from a Chinese point of view was that, of course, that the armed forces played a critical role in all the COVID relief measures. But the big headline was that, irrespective of that, there was not a single infection reported in the armed forces. I want you to talk to us a little bit about the assessment that we worked on, how we sort of looked at analyzing the impact of COVID on the Chinese armed forces. Because like you said, this was also a big year for them and they were supposed to achieve modernization goals. From what I understand, there were also some changes from a recruitment point of view. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Correct. So we can literally divide China's battle against COVID in three parts. First was before the PLA was active, before the PLA was brought in to fight to help in logistics for COVID hospitals. Second was the statement that was made in early March, where it was being claimed that there are no infections within the PLA troops who are fighting on the ground. And third is, in reality, how PLA handled it. So I'll dwell into the third part first. So once the PLA was brought in, you can really see how the party state and military apparatus came together in fighting against COVID, because the kind of mobilization that was done across all four services of the PLA. So basically what was done was the medical team across all the services, and especially in the one which is based out of Hubei and Wuhan, were brought to the forefront. And different services were used to mobilize this. So Air Force was used in large numbers to mobilize this, and the kind of apparatus that were used for the mobilization was something to be given credit to. So that's one thing which helped the mobilization helped China quote unquote to bring COVID under control. The second part of it, where the claim was being made that there are no infection despite so many PLA soldiers on the ground, I think our assessment points out that this claim cannot be true. If you do simple math, and the math that we did was the number of civilians that are being infected in the population, and applying the same logic to the number of people that are infected in military. A basic amount of 100, near the 100 PLA are at least infected due to this. And the first part is before the PLA was brought in. In that part, I think, as I have already pointed out, you can see the difference when the PLA was brought in, before the PLA was brought in. And one thing that highlights throughout the experiment with PLA that happened during COVID is that PLA has been thoroughly criticized over several years for its mobilization, that it is not combat ready. There are problems with mobilization. For example, if there is a problem in one part, it cannot be mobilized from other part to that part. So the reforms that have taken place and addressing certain issues like integration of multiple services to address a challenge, this was a real testing ground for PLA to show that mobilization is not a problem anymore, or at least they are working on it. And I think the COVID was a good experience to achieve that for the PLA.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's something that's often less understood of how how this particular crisis can actually be an opportunity from the point of view of testing your logistics supply systems, your ability to mobilize large forces and take action combined. And that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that often gets overlooked. On the point of view of the data, I think, yeah, I agree with you. Right now, we looked at, and I'm just sort of, because I have the paper in front of me that we worked on, so I'm just going to sort of share some data points for people if they don't remember. And you can obviously, we'll try and link this document in the show notes so you can actually go back and read it. Essentially, what we had done was that Suyash had looked at how many PLA military medics essentially were deployed and how many soldiers were deployed eventually. And what we got that there was about 1,200 medics besides other militia members and PLA personnel, and around 6 to 7,000 total PLA soldiers who were deployed. Among these, there were around 4,000 military medics who were responsible for aiding all epidemic control efforts in the area. And what we did was we just looked at, if you have PLA doctors being employed to deal with the pandemic, and if you have civilian doctors deployed to deal with the pandemic, what is the rate of infection among civilian doctors in China? And what we got was that we got a sense of the rate of infection among those people, and then we looked at applying that same figure to military personnel and PLA doctors, and we got a sense of about at the very least you would have about 86 to 100 people who would have been infected, even if you were to just go by that parameter. So therefore, it just doesn't seem that claim that nobody was infected just seems absurd. The other thing that we looked at was if you just move away from who's been immediately deployed, but just look at the, Wuhan's an important city, Hubei is an important province, is in the heart of China. If you just look at how many facilities of the PLA exist in that part of the country, you'll get a sense of how large the troop presence would be in the country, in that part of the country in any way. So therefore, it would be quite surprising that none of them would have been infected, given that the city was undergoing a serious crisis. So that document is available. The third part in that document actually that we looked at was recruitment, Suyash. Can you explain there was a change that was supposed to happen in 2020 and that didn't really happen because of the pandemic. So what were the implications of that? Firstly, could you explain to us what the change was, and then secondly, what were the implications of that?
Yes, Manoj. So initially the recruitment happened once a year, and it started in July, August, and went all till September, October, November. So what the PLA, and it was a claim, it was a demand made by various academics in China as well as PLA veterans that we should have, we as in China should have, same number of recruits should be recruited in a year, but they should be divided into two parts. The first phase of the recruitment should start in January and go on till April, and second phase of recruitment should start in August, September, and go until the end of the year. And so, for example, if 100 people were recruited at the end of the year, now they should be divided in 50-50. Just I'm giving basic numbers. So this was supposed to happen in 2020. A notification was issued that recruitment is supposed to start, but the COVID came in and the recruitment happened in first phase as it used to happen earlier, in one phase only. Interesting point now in 2021, they have shifted to two-phase recruitment again. So now they have initiated that, and now recruitment right now, as we talk, the PLA recruitment is happening right now. Why this is important? Because if you are recruiting a certain number of people at the end of the year, by the time, so PLA like India or India like PLA, Indian Army like PLA is a large force, and there are large retirements every year. So that's the one point. So they have to the demand for this is made because they have to match retirement with getting new members, and second, because the modernization is happening in rampant scale, and there is a demand supply problem in the PLA. So the number of machines or the kind of machines that they are deploying or the vessels that they are deploying, there is not enough supply of qualitative young personnel to man those machines. So the quality and the quantity of recruitment is changing. This was an attempt made in 2020, but it couldn't go through because of the pandemic, and now they have started it in 2021. So as we talk, the reforms are underway.
Okay, that's interesting. So basically they are reverting to what they were supposed to do because they couldn't do it last year because of the way COVID had impacted the country and their activities. The other interesting thing of this was that, for a lot of the, challenges that may have come because of recruitment, one of the advantages perhaps of COVID, and I don't know if this will sustain because the Chinese economy has come back very, very rapidly. It's sort of growing again very, very rapidly. But one of the advantages that, if employment shrinks, then, the army and the state becomes an important factor in employment. And I presume that there have been some cases where increasingly more qualified talent, which could not have gotten into or which would not have looked at the PLA as an attractive option when the economy is down and when the private sector is not necessarily hiring, would be looking for a secure position and would find the army much more appealing than they would have maybe pre-COVID era. So that's another thing that sort of I think COVID probably did assist them with. But at the same time, there was sort of two other areas that we haven't yet touched upon because we've spoken largely about internal response to COVID and impact. But there were two other areas where we saw, by sometime in March, we saw the PLA getting very aggressive, particularly in the South China Sea, and then subsequently in late April and early May with the border with India. Can you tell us a little bit about what was the narrative around this? What exactly was happening in late March? What were the incidents in the South China Sea?
So initially, even I analyzed it I thought of it in a certain way that because of pandemic, the PLA and China are getting active in South or getting more assertive in South China Sea. And this was the very dominant narrative surrounding all the activities that were happening from December end to early March, mid-March. But that's not the only reason, and certainly that's not the reason for Chinese assertiveness. But it happened simultaneously because that is why such causations were drawn. So in that phase, especially starting from December, China started becoming more assertive with all the regional stakeholders in South China Sea regarding its territorial dispute. So when I say assertive, certain things like China is typically known for using its research vessel for non-research activities. So a research vessel accompanied with maritime militia started entering Indonesia's territorial water. Indonesia's territorial water, Natuna territorial water, which Indonesia claims. These vessels were often found in Philippines' territorial water, the island that Philippines claim. Also, Vietnam's claim islands, partly territorial water. Apart from that, there were also other instances where a Chinese destroyer, I think a Chinese ship collided with Japanese destroyer, and a Chinese destroyer sank a Vietnamese ship. So certain things like this. Also becoming more active with Taiwan, more intrusion into Taiwan's ADIZ or crossing of Taiwan Strait more often. So these were the activities that were happening in the first half of the year, leading us to the conclusion that China has become more assertive. Initially, we thought this is pandemic opportunism because all countries are battling COVID. And by that time, when in April 2020, China had more or less controlled the narrative, at least surrounding COVID internally. That is why they were looking outside. This was the first assessment that we did. But when India stand-off started especially, later we realized that it is not just to do with COVID, it is more, there are other multiple factors for China's assertiveness. One, more control over army. Second, to test its PLA reforms, whether the reforms are implemented properly or not. These were certain reasons that we could figure out that for which China had become more assertive in early 2020.
So you're saying that there's much more than just the opportunism. But the pandemic might have provided a window, yes, but there was much more. There were many more drivers to what we saw. Yet, I mean, what we've seen is that we've not really seen, not strangely, but I mean, I was expected that we've not really seen Beijing achieve any objectives per se. I mean, for example, even in Eastern Ladakh, at the end of the day, it's a stalemate, and strategically, those actions have essentially damaged China's relationship with India. In some ways, the level of trust that you worked for the last couple of years to try and develop, which obviously didn't really anyway exist. They seem to have damaged it much more for certain tactical ends, and which even today it's kind of confusing as to what those tactical ends were that they were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like, and likewise in the South China Sea, right? In the South China Sea, you've seen, they've been talking the code of conduct, yet you've seen far more aggression. And at the end of the day, as a product of that aggression, you saw far more American military activity in the South China Sea. I think at one point of time, there were two large US vessels, I think, in the South China Sea, which, I think this was in July or August sometime, and you've had the Chinese sort of reacting to that. So it just seems like some of this necessarily is not borne fruit.
Correct. In fact, if taking a cue from what you said, in July, August, it got adverse reaction from US, where two strike groups were operating along with few Japanese and Australian ships, a joint statement from ASEAN, which has not happened before, and the US's change of policy or position towards South China Sea. So these were certain impactful developments as a reaction to China's increased assertiveness, which was happening. And there were no, as you have rightly pointed out, there were no credible gains from China due to change of his position or becoming more assertive, both in South China Sea as well as on front with India. So there was more damage done than gaining anything. Minor tactical ground in India at the cost of larger strategic relation and larger strategic balance is at this point of time thinking without is not something very credible to do or not something very useful to do, I think.
Okay, so we've covered some of the friction points that they had in terms of territorial disputes. We've talked about how COVID impacted the domestic sort of situation with regard to the PLAs, modernization with regards to infections and with regards to the PLAs, the pluses and the minuses with regards to its deployment abilities. Let's come to the sort of, the time when the pandemic has largely eased in China, which is later half of the year. What are the sort of, you had in October, you had this big meeting, in November, you had the end of the, late October and November, you had that, the fifth plenary session, which came up with an interesting new objective, right? I mean, you told us about the goals of the PLA being 2020, mechanization, 2035, and then 2049. But this document comes out after the fifth plenary session and it talks about 2027 as a goal. What exactly is that goal?
So PLA modernization is divided into three parts, as Xi Jinping has already claimed. First one was mechanization. A lot of analysis, a lot of Western analysis that has been done point that mechanization has not been achieved. Mechanization was to be divided into three phases. The third phase of mechanization is not yet being achieved. So 2027, as we all know, is a centenary year for the PLA. The communique is an important document that came out this side, which laid a lot of emphasis on economic reforms for China. But my assessment is that it's also largely what Taylor Fravell has said, and I'm quoting him. He has also pointed out that 2027 deadline was from 2049, which was supposed to be when PLA is to be turned into a world-class force, is taken to 2027 just to expedite China's military reforms, to increase the pace of China's military reforms, which have slowed over the past 2 years. One, and also to celebrate this year because it's 100th year of the PLA. So these are the two reasons. There are no speeches or there are no press conferences by any. If certain goal has been changed, it is certainly backed up by military press conference. So there are no speeches by major leaders within China, or there are no press conferences to back the claim that 2077 is the deadline. It's just a date to celebrate 100th year and also to speed up the reforms which have in past 2 years lagged a bit. So that is why 2027, and also to show to the country and outside world that along with economic reforms, military reforms are equally important. And that is why in the communique, along with economic reforms, military reforms were given equal importance.
Okay. So that's an interesting way to look at it. It's not really something that you're bringing forward and saying that we've done much more and we've changed. Actually, it's sort of highlighting the significance of both these arms, economic reforms and military reforms. Fascinating. At the same time, you also had some other changes in terms of, subsequently in the weeks that followed, you had some other changes in terms of the PLA's doctrine.
Correct.
How significant is that?
So that was the most significant change of the year. One of the most important development of the year, that there was new operational doctrine rolled out for PLA. So what is an operational doctrine? I'm quoting again Professor Taylor Fravell from his book Active Defense, where he explains that it refers to the principles and concepts that describe how military plans to conduct its operations. So in the past, there have been only 4 or 5 instances where the doctrine, operational guidelines have been changed. And operational guideline changes whenever there is a change of military strategy. a larger change or the broader change, a smaller change. So the last time the operational guideline was changed was in 1999. This was the time when there was 1993 strategy, which was high-tech condition, modern wars under high-tech condition. After that, there have been two important changes in China's military strategy. One was it started the strategy that was adopted in 2004, that was local wars under informatized condition, and the second one that was adopted just before the reforms in 2015, informatized local wars. So on a broader level, the nature of warfare is changing, and so is the Chinese army. This is coupled with the latest military reforms. So all this put together gives us a perspective that there needs to be new operating doctrine to handle to fight newer wars in an improvised condition, and that is why new operational doctrine has been rolled out. We don't know what that operational doctrine would be, but over the years, as China participates in different military exercises or its activities on its border, can give us a hint of what it would be in the future.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing, right? I mean, there's nothing, it's a very prosaic sort of statement about a change in doctrine and sort of a brief outline of it without any details really being provided at all about what it implies and what it entails. And that's what requires, one to sort of keep tracking this space from a broad perspective to be able to understand what are the likely changes that one could look at in such a doctrine. Let's look at sort of, towards the end of the year, you had these two big developments. I remember reading a piece written by a couple of PLA sort of academics, and they were talking about, the significance of the year and what are the events in the year. And I think that's the one thing that I want to point out for people who are listening to this podcast in terms of how the PLA looked at the world. And I'll share this again. I'll share this piece in the show notes again. It's in English, so people can read it. It's a fairly long piece. It talks about what are the sort of different developments and how the PLA views the world. A few quotes from them. They look at the strategic changes of policies of the US and Russia. They say that the US has intensified ties with Taiwan, expanded operations in South China Sea, and is working with partners to, quote, forge an anti-China alliance. On Russia, they say that there's greater effort to build military bases in Africa. They say Moscow has, quote, turned the table in Syria, which is a little bit of a pushback against the US. They also talk about Russia's ability to have mediated the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And they talk about reinforced military deployments by Russia in southern Kuril Islands. So essentially, they're looking at these two as the big military powers in the world, which are making changes. The piece also then talks about Japan, India, the UK, France, all of them in sort of one basket. And they talk about how these, so you can see these as middle powers, whereas China, Russia, and the US in their perspective are great powers competing. And they talk about how these middle powers have essentially tried to create more space for themselves. So that's an interesting thing. They also talk about how, as time has gone on, the frequency and intensity of use of force by various countries has changed and has intensified. They talk about how apart from world or regional powers, many middle-sized countries or smaller countries are also increasingly using force. And in that, they cite examples of the India-Pakistan tensions and the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as examples of this. So that's quite interesting from my point of view, that, they are analyzing the world and they're looking at it and they're saying that it's becoming much more violent. And it's becoming much more violent for a number of reasons, but one of them chiefly is that technology is permitting even smaller states to engage, or less powerful states to engage in far more violence than they would have otherwise. And there's some sort of key points that they identify, which I want to highlight. One is that they talk about changes in combat patterns owing to technological advancements, which is something that I just said. They talk about the use of UAVs by the US, Russia, and also as it was evident in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. They talk about how all of this tells us that the capability of innovation is at the core, is the core competence of a military force. And as struggles are going to become far more intense and fierce, you will need to focus on military innovation. And then there are 4 trends that they highlight that have sort of appeared through the year. And these are beyond just sort of, the use of asymmetric warfare, but they talk about the development of hypersonic weapons, the development of laser weapons, expansion in terms of nuclear development, and they talk about a heated nuclear race. And lastly, the weaponization of outer space. So these are trends that they see which are going to impact things going forward in 2021. So again, areas of interest for people who keep track of all of these things. So Yash, I want to come to you for final thoughts on 2021. What are the things that we should look out for in 2021? It's a big year again from the Communist Party's point of view. It's a centenary. So what are the kind of things that we should look out for?
Yes. So one, the recruitment that has started right now, as we talk, recruitment is happening. To the ongoing standoff, because it's not over yet. There are no activities or no aggressive things that have thankfully happened since past 2-3 months. But yes, the ongoing standoff. Third area to be watchful about is the South China Sea. And the fourth and more important point is July 21, 2021. Which is a centenary for CCP. 2 things. One, would there be a parade which would show newer innovations of the PLA? And 2, would any drastic step be taken before that? That is something that I don't think it would be taken, but we need to be watchful about these 2 things for 2020.
I think the drastic step that you're wondering about is probably Taiwan, because that's the, given what Beijing has done in Hong Kong, it seems like that's the one pending sort of challenge from Xi Jinping's point of view. Interesting that's something that we need to keep an eye on because, one never knows. In this transition with America itself, you're seeing Beijing getting far more aggressive in Hong Kong without the fear of pushback. So let's see if that's something that they try with Taiwan or something breaks out in that context. Because I think that's the real flashpoint that remains in the region at the moment.
Correct.
All right. So with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you so much, Suyash, for all the insights. And if you did find this interesting, please do subscribe to Suyash's newsletter. We'll link it in the show notes also. He's done a wonderful wrap up of the year developments in PLA, of which some we have talked about today and not all. So you can check that out. We'll share the link in the show notes. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So everybody, please do help us out with our survey if you haven't filled it out yet. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. This survey is really helpful for us, and fill out the survey completely and we'll put you into a lucky draw and we will send you some IVM swag. And what a great week of episodes we had, and what an eventful week we had. Let me run through some of the episode highlights really quickly. On Pesa Vesa, Samir Nair of Applause Entertainment was on to discuss the web series Scam 1992. Great conversation with Anupam was had. Do check that out. Bhavish Sumaya of Hasbro was on Advertising is Dead. On Positively Unlimited, Chitna is starting a new series from A to Z. This week, Align. Do check that out. And on GabyCD, Farhad and Sunitra asked the question, what if they were straight? Interesting conversation. Definitely do check that out. I think you'll enjoy that. And one piece of news for you guys. Cyrus Says is now live on YouTube every weekday at 10 a.m. If you go to our IVM Podcast YouTube channel, you'll be able to catch us over there. And stay tuned for a lot more video content coming out in the next couple of weeks. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे।
Only on the नानकरी पॉडकास्ट every Wednesday, सिर्फ IVM पॉडकास्ट ऐप या वेबसाइट पर, या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो।